Class is now in session. I'm Professor Hockey, and today we'll be discussing Game 4 of the regular season for the San Jose Sharks. They took on the Utah Mammoth and lost by a score of 6-3. This was the Sharks' first road game of the season, and it was perhaps thought that the change of scenery could do them some good and switch up their fortunes, but instead we ended up just getting more of the same thing. The Sharks came into tonight leading the entire league in terms of goals against per game at just over 5, and that increased even further here tonight as they give up 6 against a Utah Mammoth team that previously this season had actually been struggling to put the puck in the net. But not the case here tonight for them, as they opened it up with a Nick Schmaltz 5-on-3 power play goal and then a Nick Schmaltz 5-on-5 even strength goal to make it 2-0 by the end of this first period. And the Sharks were actually rather fortunate that the score wasn't even more lopsided than this because of just how dominant Utah looked for the vast majority of this opening frame. We saw the Sharks close out last game against Carolina, putting up a grand total of 0 shots across the entirety of that third period. Well, that carried into tonight's game as they only registered their first shot on goal at about the halfway mark of this opening period. Not a good look whatsoever, but at the very least, in the last couple of minutes, they did start to show a little bit of fight, and that managed to carry over into the second period where Tyler Toffoli and Jeff Skinner would score to bring this back to a tie game. And the Sharks actually had a decent amount of momentum at this point, looked to be in the driver's seat, but then this O'Brien goal does get scored. It is an unfortunate one, an unlucky bounce behind the net as Askarov leaves to go and play the puck, and it makes it 3-2. Utah gives them the lead back, but most teams would be able to bounce back from this bit of adversity. Most teams would look at this and say that we have been the better team for the entirety of this second period. This shouldn't change that, and we can go out and get that game-tying goal, and maybe even a game-winning goal as well. But unfortunately, the Sharks are not most teams. They have the mental toughness of a wet napkin, and so instead, as we go into the third period, a 3-2 deficit turns into a 4-2, then 5-2, then 6-2 deficit before finally Celebrini does stop the bleeding, makes it 6-3, but it is way too little too late. There isn't even a goaltender that gets pulled here to try and make the comeback, and the Sharks lose this one 6-3, their fourth loss in a row to open up this season. It is still a far cry from the 9-game losing streak of last season and the 11-game losing streak of the year before that, but we are inching closer and closer. And there isn't even necessarily much to kind of hang your hat on here. Yes, that first game against Vegas was rather well played, and they probably should have been able to win that, but these last 3 have just been absolutely disastrous. They got crushed by Anaheim, they got crushed by Carolina, and outside of like a brief window of good play here tonight against Utah, they got crushed by the Mammoth as well. At least in the previous season, there was a good 40 or so one-goal losses that were exciting to watch, even if some of them included the Sharks blowing it in the third period. This season, I would even take those types of games instead of here tonight against Utah or Carolina, where they just get walked from minute 1 onwards. Anyway, moving on to the players to talk about, before we actually get into those on the ice here tonight, we once again have to start out with the one who is not. I would much more want to actually talk about the players who actually participated, but as long as Warsofsky continues to make some questionable lineup decisions, this is where we have to go to each time, as Michael Misa remains out of the lineup for this one, or at least he gets taken back out of the lineup, I should say, as he is now a healthy scratch for the 3rd time across 4 games this season. And the thing is that from a kind of in a vacuum standpoint, this is a decision that does make some sense. This is the first half of a back-to-back with travel. So the Sharks are in Utah here tonight. They will be flying back to San Jose for the game tomorrow against the Pittsburgh Penguins. I could absolutely see the perspective of having Misa sit this one out, but that really only makes sense if Misa had actually played the first 3 games of this season. If he was in the lineup against Vegas, Anaheim, and Carolina, and then didn't play here tonight against Utah, assuming he hadn't been putting up like incredible performances, I would have been perfectly fine with that decision. But the fact that he already missed 2 of the first 3 games and then sits out this one here tonight as well, that much I just don't really understand. And the broadcast here tonight on ESPN actually had John Tortorella on, and he was talking between the periods and the intermission and also before the game, and he was asked about this Misa situation. And John Tortorella is notoriously known as a very old school, no-nonsense, hard-nosed type of coach. The whole joke last season when he was the head coach of the Philadelphia Flyers was that he was going to completely torpedo Matvei Mishkov's rookie season because of just kind of how old school he really is. And yet even he was talking about how he would be playing Michael Misa in these games, and he doesn't really understand why he is actually sitting out as often as he is. Well, Tortorella, you can join the club, because none of us outside of Warsofsky seem to understand this perspective that has been taken. Will Smith, is constantly pointed to from this past season as, the development path. Oh, he's going to sit out some games. But again, as I had mentioned before, Will Smith has played or missed just 5 games due to that development plan. We are just 4 games into the season, and Misa has already missed 3 of them. I just don't really understand this logic, and he doesn't play here tonight. And the thing is that whether he's in the lineup or not, the Sharks are losing games anyways, so why not see what you have out of this 18-year-old player? Now we can move on to the players to talk about, but instead of starting off with the forwards, I'm going to actually start off with the goaltender, because it was an interesting night for Yaroslav Askarov. On the surface here, he gives up 6 goals, and it does not look very good at all, and the Sharks goaltenders have been struggling all throughout this season at this point, and I certainly haven't been above calling them out. I mentioned how Askarov had a really rough night against Anaheim with multiple weak goals given up. And I mentioned how Nedeljkovic had a really rough night against Carolina with multiple weak goals given up. And so it would look as though things have continued much the same here tonight with Askarov, but I actually don't think that that's the case. Obviously, this O'Brien goal does stand out, and I'll get to that a little bit later. But if you take a look at the other 5, these are all from incredibly dangerous positions. All 3 Schmaltz goals are pretty much from the exact same position on the ice, directly in the slot, which is the most dangerous area to be taking these shots. And even the Keller and Carcone ones are from between the face-off dots. Like, these are from way too close. The Sharks defense did absolutely 0 favors for Askarov, and even if you had the best goaltender in the league, even if you had like Connor Hellebuck between the pipes for this game, I wouldn't be surprised if out of those 5 chances, he had let in at least like 3, maybe even 4 of them, because of just how dangerous these opportunities truly were. So yes, are you looking at this and maybe hoping Askarov could come up with like 1 more big save? Perhaps, but he had some really good moments in the first period, in the early parts of the second period, really trying to keep the Sharks in this game, and then it just kind of all falls apart because the San Jose Sharks defense is doing absolutely nothing good in front of him. Now, when it comes to this O'Brien goal, yes, this does not look very good at all, and it kind of brings up the age-old debate of what you really expect from your goaltender. One perspective, and Tortorella, who I mentioned earlier on, did have this perspective as well, is that if you're the goaltender, just kind of stay in your net. Don't try to do too much. Don't try to be the hero if you're not confident in doing that, because if you make a mistake like this, it can really end up killing your momentum. But I'm actually going to disagree with that, and I've made this known in the past, and I'll continue to make this known. I think having a goaltender who's willing and capable and does well at playing the puck is extremely important for a team's defensive structure. If your goalie always stays between the pipes and never goes out to play it, yes, you'll avoid these types of O'Brien type of goals that are very obviously on the goaltender's shoulders, but it is much less noticeable the other kind of openings that you'll end up giving to the other team by never going out and playing that puck. Just imagine Utah dumps this puck in. If Askarov goes as it rims around the boards to play it, gets it to his defenseman, and then the defenseman passes it to a forward, that's an easy breakout. But if the goalie doesn't go to play it, it rims around, maybe it turns into a 50-50 puck race or a puck battle, and then Utah gets back possession. Perhaps even 20 seconds later or so, the puck ends up in the back of the net, and you'd never go back and look and say, oh, the goalie should have come out to play that puck. But it is something that makes a big difference on a play-to-play, a shift-to-shift, a game-to-game basis. And so I don't think that this is something that you need to kind of nail into Askarov and say, nope, never come out to play this puck. But obviously, especially with how the first game went against the Vegas Golden Knights, it doesn't really look good that the San Jose Sharks are once again burned, quite significantly so, by yet another similar type of error. Moving on to the actual forwards on the ice here for this game, we have the top line of Skinner, Celebrini, and Kurashev. I had mentioned in the previous game that Skinner had probably been the best forward for the Sharks up to this point, and that he might be in line for yet another promotion up to the top line. Not so much to have Skinner playing with Celebrini, but perhaps even to just have Celebrini playing with Skinner to try and get him going, because Celebrini has had not the greatest of starts to this season thus far. And it does seem to have actually worked out. Celebrini, I thought, was the Sharks' best forward in this game, honestly by like a pretty significant margin. Celebrini was trying to do it all, and he was almost managing to pull it off, and he ends up picking up a couple of points here tonight, including his first goal of the season. But you do kind of feel bad for him because it's just not enough. It was far from his fault here that the Sharks end up giving 6 goals, and yet here we are. So definitely not excusing the rougher play from the first 3 games, but kind of do feel bad for Celebrini being on this team that just can't seem to put much together at all. When it comes to his 2 line mates, as I mentioned with Skinner, had previously been the Sharks' best forward up to this point, and I think here tonight it continued to do some pretty good things. Nothing outstanding or anything, but he does manage to put a goal up on the board, even if it was on a lucky bounce, and it's just driving the play forward, being solid, and so you do kind of like how he has looked thus far. When it comes to Kurashev, somewhat hit or miss. Like, he had a couple of good shifts here in this game, but was very clearly the weakest player on this top line, and I don't really think he's someone who the Sharks will want to keep along on this top line. Drop him to the second, drop him to the third, try to find a bit of a different solution here for this top trio. When it comes to the Sharks' second line, it is Eklund, Wenberg, and Toffoli yet again. We have seen this a couple of times this season. It hasn't really had a ton of success. I will say, however, that this was probably this line's best game of the season. In particular, the player who I think really stood out to me was Alex Wenberg, who I thought had a really strong game here. Well, a relatively strong game, I should say. Obviously, the starting 15 or so minutes was absolutely awful for pretty much everybody. But after that, I thought Wenberg was actually a bit of a driving force on this line, which is something that this trio desperately needs, and that did help create some decent offense. I thought Eklund also had a pretty decent game as well. Toffoli, not as much, though he does manage to score on the power play, and so that's just kind of Tyler Toffoli. When it comes to the Sharks' third line, here we have Dellandrea, Smith, and Colin Graf. And so this third line was a big story of tonight, as it does have to do with Will Smith finding himself here on this trio. There was a lot of discussion when this was put together in practice, or not exactly this line, but when Smith found himself on the third line in practice a couple of days ago, and it was kind of viewed as a demotion at the time. And I was ready to give this whole speech about how that wasn't really the case, because the Sharks do have a good amount more forward depth this season. For instance, last year when Will Smith was placed onto the third line, he was flanked by Barclay Goodrow and Luke Cunnin, 2 players who probably shouldn't even be in the NHL, but at best are like 13th forwards. You see Goodrow kind of hanging on by a thread here as this fourth liner here with the worst team in the league, and Luke Cunnin is playing fourth line, I believe, with the Florida Panthers, but mostly because the Panthers have like half a dozen injuries up front. Otherwise, they're probably not doing much here. And so that is definitely viewed more so as a demotion. But Smith, in that practice, had been placed with both Colin Graf and Michael Misa. That's actually a pretty interesting trio of players, and I was excited to see what Smith would be able to do with those two. But instead, last-second decision, it seems, being made. Smith gets placed with Graf still, but it is tied to Dellandrea, who is centering the 2 of them. And this line just does not make any sense, and it showcased itself on the ice. Individually, all 3 of these players were not very good, but you know how people will sometimes say that, oh, these 3 were the greater of the sum of their parts? Well, this was basically the exact opposite of that. As I mentioned, none of them were all that great, but together they were even worse than that. There was just no chemistry. There was nothing doing. There were a couple of decent moments for each of these players. Like, I thought Dellandrea had a couple of okay shifts. Same goes with Smith. Same goes with Colin Graf. But all in all, it ended up making up by far the worst line of the night for the San Jose Sharks. This is not something that I want to see at all, these 3 players together for the following game. Get Misa back in there. Maybe have Misa play with Graf and Smith and to see if it takes a different look. But we'll see what Warsofsky ends up deciding to do here, because this was definitely not it. When it comes to the Sharks' fourth line, we have Goodrow, Gaudette, and Reeves. This is the one line that has remained together for the entirety of this season. And credit where credit is due, as much as I have, criticized this trio of players, or at least in particular both Goodrow and Ryan Reeves, they did have a decent night here. In particular, you take a look at the end of that first period. I had mentioned how momentum began to shift in favor of the Sharks over those last few minutes. A big reason for that is that this fourth line was able to come out, and it wasn't anything pretty, it wasn't anything impressive, but they got into the offensive zone, they forechecked a little bit, they got the puck up to the point, they got a shot near the net, and it did get things rolling for San Jose. And so does some credit some credit definitely does need to go towards these three players, but there is one who I do want to highlight for this game for a little bit of a different reason, and that is Ryan Reaves. When the Sharks originally acquired Ryan Reaves in that Henry Thrun trade, I disliked the move very much because I thought he would end up just creating some bloat in the Sharks forward group because he would basically have to remain in the NHL with the Sharks, and it would just prevent certain young players from actually getting a lineup spot. And it seems as though I was 100% correct about that, considering, as I already mentioned earlier on, Misa has played just one of 4 games this season for the Sharks. You can trace that back to Ryan Reaves being a mainstay on this fourth line thus far. But a lot of people were in favor of this trade from what I saw. And one of the big reasons for that was that Ryan Reaves was supposed to come in and be this kind of protector for the Sharks' young players, that his presence on this team and on the bench or the ice or what have you would prevent other teams from trying to take a run or take any liberties with the Sharks' rookie talents, whether that be Dickinson or Smith or Misa or Celebrini, not necessarily rookies, but young players that are on this team. We didn't actually see a ton of that last year, but I guess Ryan Reaves was supposed to immediately eliminate all of it this season. But we are just 4 games into the year, and in this game tonight against Utah, we got to see Logan Cooley put Macklin Celebrini in like a headlock and wrestle him down to the ice. And unsurprisingly, Ryan Reaves is looking on from the bench because he's never going to be on the ice with Celebrini. And even past that, with a couple more shifts in the game, Reaves did absolutely nothing. There was no prevention. There was no intimidation. There was nothing of the sort, not even like a performative random fight against another fourth liner to send a message to the Utah Mammoth. Nothing of the sort occurred. And so you do have to go back and wonder what exactly Ryan Reaves, the acquisition here, is supposed to be doing in terms of protecting these young players, because Celebrini got a run taken at him, and other guys on the ice like Desharnais and Dickinson were there to step up and try to defend him in that situation, while Ryan Reaves did absolutely nothing. So he's not preventing anybody from doing anything. He's not answering the bell of any sort. So it's just, the acquisition, again, to me, continues to not make much sense when the one role that he was supposedly brought in to do is not actually being filled. When it comes to the Sharks' defense, the major thing to notice here is that there is another absence. No Shakir Mukhamadullin yet again, but at the very least, Warsofsky does have an excuse this time around. In the 2 previous games, it seemed as though he was a healthy scratch, but tonight it was an injury. He got injured apparently during practice, and so not in the lineup for tonight's game, and will probably not be in the lineup for tomorrow's game. That is a significant loss, assuming Warsofsky would have actually put him into the lineup, which is not a safe assumption to be made, by the way, but it ends up obviously continuing to hurt this Sharks defensive core that did not end up having a good night. But if we start off with this top pairing of Leddy and Orlov, these two were not necessarily the problem. Now, that's not to say that they played well, because they kind of didn't, but they weren't like this massive issue. So I'm actually going to start off with the second defensive pairing of Ferraro and Iorio, the newest San Jose Shark, being added just yesterday off of waivers from the Washington Capitals. I imagine the Sharks would have not wanted to actually have him play this game, and in a perfect world would have had Mukhamadullin in the lineup and Iorio could get some time to get acclimated here to the San Jose Sharks. But because of that surprising injury that Mukhamadullin did have, Iorio is here for tonight's game, and it was a complete disaster. Every single game, besides the Vegas one, the San Jose Sharks have had one defensive pairing that has just completely sunk their performance. Against Anaheim, it was Leddy and Klingberg. Against Carolina, it was Dickinson and Klingberg. And tonight, it is Ferraro and Iorio. Iorio had multiple defensive zone giveaways that led to some great chances and even a couple of goals. There was that terrible pass looking to Mario Ferraro that ended up leading to another goal for Utah. It just did not look pretty. It did not look good. And I even mentioned in a tweet during the game that Iorio looks like a perfect fit for the San Jose Sharks because of just how bad he was in this game. It fits right into almost every other San Jose Sharks defenseman who has been equally as bad thus far this season. And of course, his defensive partner does him zero favors. Ferraro also looked really bad in this game. Is that perhaps because Iorio wasn't looking good at all? Maybe, but Ferraro his own issues for sure. For instance, on that bad pass from Iorio, it does end up reaching Ferraro, just not in a great position, and then Ferraro does what he does best, which is just try to bank this puck off the glass and get it out. It's picked off, and it ends up in the back of the net just a couple of seconds later. And so this second pairing was a massive, massive issue for the San Jose Sharks tonight, and a big reason for why they end up losing this game. When it goes back to that first pairing, as I said, it's not that the Leddy and Orlov were actually all that great. In fact, they were mediocre to maybe even slightly below average still. When it comes to Dmitry Orlov, there was hopes coming into this season that he could end up filling the role as the Sharks' #1 defenseman, kind of like what we saw from Jake Wallman this past season. But Wallman had actually done like a reasonable job in that role, not as though like he was a world beater, but he did at best his best that he could. Orlov here thus far this season, far from it. He has been so unpredictable, so up and down, so risky in terms of his play. It reminds me a lot of what we would see from like Erik Karlsson in the defensive zone, where he's always kind of trying to get the puck going the other way. He's always trying to make these aggressive breakout passes, and they're frequently getting picked off, and he's finding himself out of position, and he's taking penalties. But the thing is that Erik Karlsson can get away with it because his defensive play is accompanied by elite offensive play. Orlov doesn't even have that to fall back on. And so you're getting this kind of like weird, kind of sometimes good, but sometimes bad defensive play while not really getting anything else out of this player. And so the big thing that I have always mentioned is that if Orlov was 10 years younger, he would not be playing nearly as many minutes as he currently is. But the Sharks, for one reason of just be going constantly with their veteran guys, but also because they don't exactly have a ton of other better options, especially with the massive amount of injuries they now suddenly have on their blue line, they're kind of forced to have him play in this role, and it's just not currently working out. When it comes to Nick Leddy, similar things to be said about him. He had a decent game. He has been decent at times throughout this season. Like, he was okay-ish against Carolina. He's been like a 4-on-10, 5-on-10 type of performance outside of Anaheim, where he was just an absolute disaster. But he is not a first-pairing defenseman, and Warsofsky continues to insist to have him used in that type of role. It should not be a surprise that the San Jose Sharks lead the entire league in terms of goals against per game when that is a situation that you were in. A player who was on waivers just 3 months or 4 months ago, whatever the case may be, is now your #1 defenseman. And this is not a Gustav Forsling situation where he suddenly becomes the best defensive D-man in the entire league. This is a Nick Leddy situation where he's exactly what you had expected. This is a 7th defenseman who is your #1 guy. When it comes to the Sharks' third defensive pairing, this is like the one saving grace, I will say, of this game. If there's one positive to take out of this, besides, I guess, Celebrini finding his mojo back a little bit, is this, that Sam Dickinson does end up in the lineup here tonight. It was honestly kind of questionable whether that would be the case, but because of the massive amount of injuries, the Sharks were forced to have him here, and it was a huge rebound game. He was not good against the Carolina Hurricanes the other night, and so it was a question of how he would look against Utah. Obviously, the Mammoth aren't quite as good as the Hurricanes, but a lot of people are predicting that Utah will be able to be a playoff team. They were already rather close this past season, and so Dickinson was going to have his hands full, and I thought he was up to the challenge very much so. In fact, you could even make the argument he was the Sharks' best defenseman on the ice. It's kind of hard to say because he didn't play a ton of minutes, and Orlov and Leddy got much more difficult matchups, and so it's not as evenly kind of split up, I guess you could say, but still, I thought Dickinson looked remarkably solid. I thought we saw some confidence in his game where he was making some pretty aggressive plays. He was going deep into the offensive zone, trying to jump up into the rush, which was not really something that we had been seeing much from him, even throughout the preseason, and so he's beginning to really kind of find his footing here in the NHL. It is just his third game. I don't think anybody would be surprised if we start to, continue to see some inconsistencies here, but this was a much, much greater sign that Dickinson will eventually be able to find himself at this NHL level and might be able to actually stick around for the entirety of this season. Again, still very early on, and a lot can change as things continue to play out here, but Dickinson looked quite promising. Now, I will also bring up one other thing, because this is a conversation that had been had many, many times when Dickinson was originally drafted over a year ago, but has been obviously brought back up with both players having made their NHL or the regular season NHL debuts this season. That is the comparison to Zeev Buium. The first thing to, of course, bring up is the fact that what's done is done. There's not really much of a reason to kind of rehash the past continuously and just say, oh, the Sharks should have drafted this guy, the Sharks should have drafted this guy. It doesn't really do much to help anybody at this point, and it just ends up just kind of frustrating you. But I think it also does need to be mentioned. Yes, you look at Zeev Buium and he's putting up major point totals with the Minnesota Wild thus far, but it is an incredibly different situation. I've already gone through talking about how disastrous the beginning of this season for the Sharks has been outside of that Vegas game, which, by the way, is the one game that Dickinson didn't actually play, which hopefully is a coincidence, I would say. But game 2, game 3, game 4, Anaheim, Carolina, Utah, all have been really, really bad. On the other hand, for Minnesota, Zeev Buium, surrounded by Kaprizov and Boldy and Eriksson Ek, a ton of offensive talent. And on the blue line, he's got fantastic mentors in the likes of Jared Spurgeon, Jonas Brodin. He's got Brock Faber, who was in a very similar position to him just a couple of years earlier. And so Buium is surrounded by great talent, and he is put into a position to succeed. This is a big one. I haven't watched anything of Buium this season, but I did watch the entirety of his playoff run last year with the Minnesota Wild, and he played the first 4 playoff games for Minnesota in that one, and he did not look particularly good, and yet the Wild continuously played him, even in a tight postseason first series against the Vegas Golden Knights, and they had him on the top power play unit. They had him getting big offensive minutes, and you compare that to what Sam Dickinson, the approach has been this year, where even in good games like tonight, and against Anaheim, he hasn't even managed to hit the 15-minute mark. And the only reason he was even relatively close to it in this particular game is because he got a good amount of minutes in the final few minutes of the third period. When it actually mattered, when the game was on the line, they frequently went with other players, including, Ferraro and Iorio, who had been an absolute disaster up to that point. And so it is a very, very different situation. It is way too early to make any sort of call between these two players. And so I think it is important to just kind of put the support behind Sam Dickinson, who will hopefully, and as we saw here tonight, will be able to actually figure it out. But that will do it for this review. The Sharks will be back in action tomorrow. We will take on the Pittsburgh Penguins. The good news, the Penguins are a team that, despite having had a good start here, are not expected to be a particularly good team throughout this entire year. They were one of the very, very few organizations that actually perhaps got worse this past offseason, because they're one that is actually looking to tank, or at least not do so great, and get a good draft pick for themselves. And so San Jose, they might be able to have a chance of actually getting their first win of the year. Class dismissed.